Now we're getting to the meat of the app or website, or both, we're going to build. We have the scope, we know all the pieces we need, and how they relate to each other. Now we're going to start progressing from information architecture to information design. And today, designing for touchscreens mostly, we care a great deal about how people touch the screen. When you tap a target, you are never, ever perfectly aligned. There is no such thing as perfect accuracy, so the user misses. Accuracy is relative, and we define it with what we call the circular error of probability, or CEP, which is just a mathematical representation of how much you miss a target. When everything is imprecise, we stop calling these errors and start referring to tolerances instead. As I discussed earlier, if we need to plan for imprecision and problems as part of the process, that's the way all the way down to making buttons and so forth. But let's back up and look at the whole phone again. When you account for content, position, and different devices, you find most taps are about the center half of the page. If you wonder about tablets, they're surprisingly similar, so that data is embedded in this visualization up here. And on top of this, we know that people are more accurate at the middle of the screen. We mean pretty much any screen, any way they hold their phone or tablet. They also subconsciously know this, or it may be tied to their preference for reading the middle, so they're more confident at the center, and will actually slow down to tap corner or edge targets. If we map that research differently, we can see how much more room is needed between items in various parts of the screen. The sides are a little worse than the center, but the top and bottom require much more room, and corners are just the worst. I want to go over each of these sections in turn now. Going by importance, you might think the top, or if you're an iPhone fan, the bottom, is the most important thing. But weren't you just listening? The center is where people tap, scroll to, and view whenever given the choice. Look at this very typical app design. All the info is actually in the center already. Don't be fooled by terms like primary navigation anymore. The primary function of display areas is the middle of the page. You know this. We all knew this. We just always forget about it. These items can be quite close together, with space between targets or lines as small as 7 millimeters if you need to. If you design in lists, and many mobile apps and websites work off lists, then you need to know that the sides are less accurate and less preferred to touch. They get covered up and are generally not seen as much. My preference is simply to make the whole row tappable. Click it to open options presented below, like here. But if you must put, say, checkboxes on the left and trash cans on the right, or worse yet, controls like these little switches, then you have to provide enough room. Your row height has to increase to account for these items, so each row has to be at least 8 millimeters tall now. Preferably, of course, bigger, 9 or 10 millimeters. This is not a good example, because none really exist. These are too small, too close together, and I'm never able to actually accurately activate the right-hand one. The top has special problems. For the web, you don't even always have access to the top. While it often disappears, the browser Chrome takes up the true top space, so your site masthead is pushed down in prominence. Because of this, I'd avoid very big mastheads. And I can never condone the topmost strip of it, tiny global functions. That's directly in opposition to people's ability to touch, and it's just an artifact of your desktop website, so stop it. For apps, or if you're dedicated to simulating an app with your website, the top has to be kept loose. For smaller phones like the iPhone, up through the iPhone 5, more than about 4 items is getting too tight. Items need about 12 millimeters spacing on center. Even on large phones, more than 5 or 6 is risky just on the tap spacing. Branding and menus, which we'll talk about later, are almost always placed up here. Lately, there's been a rather effective trend of putting actions up here as well. Those are items that can be done in the current context, like refresh and share. Try to limit it to a handful of these. Even if it's a tablet with plenty of room for dozens of icons, that sea of icons is hard to scan, so keep it to 2 or 3 of these actions at most. Tabs are a problem. You expect people to actually touch them at least. They're always made very narrow, short, vertically, so that doesn't provide nearly enough room for them to be tapped. People will hit the title bar items just all the time. This is the sort of thing I do instead, and which is becoming a trend anyway. Make the tabs taller. Or push the tabs to another part of the page. Even a little bit of padding between the masthead and tabs helps a lot. iOS officially thinks the Chiron, the bottom strip always docked to the edge of the viewport, is their answer to tabs and the primary navigation level. But you don't have to use it like that. Many apps use this for actions and have tabs sort of faked with gesture only. See the three dots under the home title here in Twitter? That means you can tab inside the timeline section also. It's okay, but tabs on tabs can be confusing. Your task flow document step should help prevent confusing organization like this. If you don't like the bottom items or just aren't on iOS where it's not expected, you can also put advertising there. I like to do stuff like lifted here and often add buttons there. Buttons below forms are pretty natural, like signing your name with the paper as the bottom, so I like big buttons down here as well. I would put only one thing at the bottom. If you're making a classic iOS app with a tab bar, don't have a button or add unit right above it. It reduces screen space, devalues that second bar, and increases the chances of accidental clicks. Size-wise, you need about 12 millimeters between items, remember, so your iPhone navigation should only have 4 items only. Even 5, unless you get to the bigger phones, is risky. The trend is suddenly, surprisingly, positive though. Android at least is supporting actions off the bottom of the page, so things like compose have moved from the very, very edge to up here. And this is even better in other apps. Even just Google Maps is placing controls like centering no longer in obscure corners, but somewhere over the map and larger. These are much easier to use, and I hope this trend continues, is embraced by app designers, and maybe even spreads to other platforms. That was a lot of information, and there's much more to dig into, but just try to remember these points. Put primary content and functionality in the center, usually in a list view. Avoid actions along the sides of the lists. Put your secondary actions along the top or bottom, or both. Keep edge items well spaced, so use as few as possible. In the next part, we'll continue this discussion by getting more detailed about how people hold, touch, and see their phones and tablets, and how you can take advantage of this information to design better mobile interfaces.